live on in their fairy tale world, they had time to ponder on a new aspect of indecency.
During the dark days of 1940. Out there, in the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats sent over 300 British ships to their graves. This scathing description comes from The Cruel Sea, the best-selling novel written by Nicholas Montserrat, who was a young naval lieutenant at the time. His words reflect the outrage that Britain felt as the bodies of her dead seamen were washed up on Eire's shores. But these were the words of an Englishman who cared naught for the pressures faced by the Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera and the newly independent Irish nation. Neutrality was the only policy that de Valera thought that he could pursue if Ireland was to survive. To have sided with England, the old enemy, would have risked splitting the nation, and to have joined forces with one side, be it Britain or Germany, would have invited massive retaliation from the other. The issue was so sensitive because of Ireland's strategic position. She was, as ever, the backdoor to England and guardian of the Atlantic sea routes that carried Britain's vital supplies. These strategic considerations were of such crucial importance to Britain that, in return for an end to neutrality, she was prepared to facilitate Irish unity and sacrifice Ulster.
At the heart of the issue were the so-called treaty ports, Cove and Bearhaven in County Cork and Lough Swilly in County Donegal. Under the 1921 treaty, which gave Southern Ireland independence, Britain held onto these vital strategic assets to protect her western approaches in time of war. On the eve of the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, gave the ports back to Eire in the hope of ensuring her goodwill in the imminent hostilities. This fatal decision was to cost hundreds of British, American and Irish lives.
Eire is on guard. The Nazi press has started an attack on Eire, accusing her of not observing strict neutrality. Eire is not being fooled, so she is redoubling her...
In the early months of the war, British newsreels displayed a generous indulgence towards Irish neutrality, as well as an over-optimistic belief in her ability to defend herself.
Eire is ready with her answer if the Germans attempt any sort of aggression against her.
Well, Irish neutrality was akin to American policy. Neutral unless attacked. America didn't come into the war until after Pearl Harbor. Ireland's policy was the same. Ireland wasn't attacked and stayed out. Irish neutrality had widespread support. The political parties, the churches, the media, even Irishmen in British uniforms supported Irish neutrality. And the other point was any deviation from neutrality by de Valera would have split his cabinet, his party, the parliament, public opinion, could have led to a civil war.
In May 1940, one word changed everything utterly: Dunkirk.
They're on their way home. Home from the hell that is Dunkirk, of how the Royal Navy, using nearly 1,000 ships, has brought back nearly 350,000 men. Now you are off burning Dunkirk.
The British evacuation from Dunkirk dramatically changed the focus of the conflict. Britain now stood alone, isolated on the edge of a hostile Europe. Her only lifeline stretched across the Atlantic to America. Astride it lay Ireland, now thrust centre stage in the theatre of war.
Atlantic shipping lanes to Britain pass both north and south of Ireland. Today, the southern route is within range of Nazi bombers based on France and outside the range of British-based RAF fighters. So many convoys avoid the route south of Ireland. Consequently, the northern route must often be crowded, and though Nazi bombers cannot operate up there, U-boats can mass their attack against the comparative concentration of merchant shipping. It is as air stations for fighter aircraft to protect our convoys that the Irish bases would be almost invaluable.
In and around the rocky teeth of Ireland's western seaboard, German U-boats clustered and hid, waiting to savage the Atlantic convoys. To the further outrage of the British, some crews were sustained with food and water from the occasional friendly fisherman. As her losses mounted, Britain had to act. Her instrument, Malcolm MacDonald, a high-ranking British envoy. In top-secret talks in Dublin, MacDonald held out the prospect of Irish unity in return for an end to Eire's neutrality, but de Valera refused to give. MacDonald then placed an official British offer on the table.
Eire to enter the war and the Royal Navy to use Irish ports. The RAF to fly from Irish airfields, and in exchange, a British declaration that Ireland will be united at an early date.
Ulster's government was outraged, the reaction swift and angry. Prime Minister Craigavon telegrammed Chamberlain,
"Profoundly shocked and disgusted. To such treachery to loyal Ulster, I will never be party."
De Valera rejected Britain's formal proposal, and Craigavon rattled off another telegram.
De Valera under German dictation. Strongly advocate immediate naval occupation of harbours and military advance south.
Irish sympathies, de Valera's sympathies at this time were pro-Ally, but policy had to be based not on sympathies but on interests. De Valera held staff talks with the British. He was ready to invite them across the border within hours if the Germans invaded. What he couldn't do politically, he couldn't deliver it politically, was invite the British in advance of a German invasion. He saw himself in that situation cast like John Redmond. He could see what had happened. Redmond's leadership of nationalist Ireland in the First World War, and he didn't want to repeat that. The other reason, of course, was that Germany had just swept across Europe. Germany looked invincible. It looked perhaps that the British might even have to accept a peace dictated from Berlin. How could de Valera, based on interests, policy based on interest, join with London at this moment? Chamberlain, who was in charge of the initiative, saw this point. He wrote to his sister, "The real basic fact that it is not partition which stands in the way at the moment, but the fear of Dev and his friends that we shall be beaten. They don't want to be on the losing side, and if that is unheroic, one can only say that it is very much the attitude of the world, from the USA to Romania and from Japan to Ireland."
By 1940, Hitler had decided that he could wrap up the war by occupying Ireland, crunching Britain like a nut in a cracker. His generals were ordered to draw up a plan for an air and sea assault.
Hitler's lieutenants planned the invasion of Ireland with typical Teutonic efficiency. No bog was left unmapped, no stone unturned. The invasion plan was, of course, top secret, but one copy did survive the war, and it's now here in the archive of the Imperial War Museum in London. It provides a fascinating snapshot of the way that the German army regarded Ireland half a century ago. The plan was codenamed Fall Grün, Operation Green, and far from indicating any special insight into Irish political life, it was simply a methodical piece of colour coding. Ominously, the last time the colour green had been used was for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, every invading soldier had exactly what he needed, this special information pack. Its contents contained everything he could possibly wish to know about thatched cottages in Wexford, peat bogs in County Roscommon, the rush hour in Dublin, and where to get a ship built in Belfast. The Plain Soldier's Guide also contained warnings about the weather, wet, cold and foggy, about accommodation, primitive huts with families huddled inside, and about the Irish character, unreliable and always looking for a fight. But buried away deep inside was the odd useful tidbit, like the way to the Guinness Brewery.
Golf courses were to be surveyed, although not for recreational purposes. German reconnaissance was on the lookout for beaches from which to launch the invasion, and landing strips for airborne troops flown in from France. The fairways and greens of Wexford, Waterford and Cork looked perfect. Operation Green was more than just a glint in Hitler's eye. It was deadly serious. Up to 50,000 German troops, including the cream of their assault units, trained for landings along the south and southwest coast of Ireland. Here they would form a bridgehead and advance northeast to Dublin, the goal of the Southern Front. On the Northern Front, in a separate operation, the 11th German Airborne Corps would land on the level fields of Antrim and capture the RAF airfields at Aldergrove, Nuts Corner and Long Kesh. Paratroops would land on Divis Mountain and storm down into Belfast, whilst the Luftwaffe would fly into the captured airfields. Away in the mountains, dummy paratroops would be dropped as a diversion. Ireland, said one Nazi general, would become an unsinkable German aircraft carrier. The invaders expected ready allies in the IRA.
The IRA has always regarded England's difficulty as being Ireland's opportunity, and has sought assistance from Germany in both world wars. In 1916, a German submarine brought Roger Casement to Ireland, and in 1940, another German U-boat carried another Republican passenger, Sean Russell. Russell was Chief of Staff of the IRA. The IRA was Hitler's fifth column, long cultivated by the German Secret Service. If Hitler had invaded, then Russell would have become the head of a puppet government in Ireland, as Quisling did in Norway.
But that was not to be. Russell, who'd been responsible for a bloody bombing campaign in England, was brought by U-boat from Germany, but died on board before he could meet up with his IRA comrades in Kerry. But a dozen or so rather less likely German agents did set foot on Irish soil. Dr. Ernest Weber-Droll was an Arnold Schwarzenegger of his day, professionally known as Atlas the Strong. He was dropped off in Ireland because German intelligence thought a reunion with his long-lost Irish girlfriend might be useful. The suspicions of Colonel Dan Bryan, the head of Irish intelligence, were naturally aroused by the sight of a wandering German strongman, and others too.
They sent 3 spies at another time, one of whom was an Indian. So here you have 2 Germans and an Indian walking down an unmarked Irish country road down in Cork someplace, the war raging, and they stopped a policeman or someone to ask them the way because they had the signposts were all blacked out in those days, and of course they had no maps. So whether popular legend has it that they stopped a policeman, but be that as it may, whoever they stopped promptly informed the policeman, so they hit the jail before they hit any espionage activities.
But the Germans didn't just send in the clowns. Hermann Goetz was a true professional, infiltrated to organise IRA sabotage.
He had a very poor opinion of the IRA, and probably some IRA man was tailed to his house. He summed them up by saying that before they went out on a job, they seemed to look into their pockets to ensure they had the most incriminating documents possible on their person, so that when they were inevitably captured, they'd be able to betray the greatest number of their colleagues. That was his regular army officer, German officer, sort of condescension to the bungling amateur.
Goetz was captured, but he committed suicide in jail rather than face deportation.
They actually didn't affect the material progress of the war at all, but they put Churchill's blood pressure up a little because he was always inclined to look towards the Green Isle with a certain amount of fire in the eye, and this confirmed his worst suspicions that the Irish were hobnobbing with the Nazis. But the whole thing was more real, more imagined than real.
Times were tense. Irish soldiers stood ready for action, a confusing sight in their German-style helmets. As for the IRA, de Valera gave no quarter.
Well, de Valera had turned completely against the IRA by the time the war broke out. He had been, as it were, taking an IRA tail in his electoral entourage, making very Republican-sounding statements. But once he brought in his own constitution in 1937, he decided the country was Republican enough, and he didn't want them. And when he found that his neutrality position was being impugned, or possibly impugned by the IRA, he was completely ruthless. After the magazine Fort Raid on the outbreak of World War II, where the IRA made off with practically all the Irish Army's ammunition, he cracked down.
6 IRA men were executed. 3 more were allowed to die on hunger strike. But such problems were of naught compared to those Ulster